Thousands of black people felt the victory and saw James Meredith as an example to follow, a symbol, like the Little Rock Nine, of their own power to move the nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Meredith.
You all cut that part out. But
It wasn't in there. I know what you're talking about.
The first thing that Governor Boris Barnett said, which one of you is James Meredith? Yeah. Now, you understand.
I was looking for
That
it.
was the second time he'd done that joke. And he later told my wife that he did it that time, which you didn't show, because it came over so big the first time when there wasn't no TV camera. He had to do it before the camera. I'm certainly sure, although he never told me this, but I'm almost positive that most of the shenanigans that Governor Barnett pulled off was designed to protect the black people in Mississippi. I mean, because like when he called them, all of the law officers, officials, all of called to Jackson to protect him from the feds. He knew the feds wasn't coming to arrest him. What he really wanted all those sheriffs and other people to do was to come where he could watch over them so they wouldn't take things in their own hand and mistreat blacks all over the state. Now, so, I mean, I have long believed that most whites were as dissatisfied with the status quo as any black.
Now, you also sought out the NAACP and wrote a letter to then Thurgood Marshall. Why did you seek their involvement? Was this just legal protection at this point?
Well, basically, that was Medgar Evers. He wanted to get the NAACP involved, and he almost got real big trouble because, you know, the NAACP is one thing, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is another. And he didn't contact the NAACP lawyer. He contacted Thurgood Marshall, which was a different group. And so that's how that came about.
Although Thurgood Marshall remarked that this man has got to be crazy to challenge Mississippi officials, he assigned the case to Constance Baker Motley, who we saw in the film.
If I had to credit one single person for making things happen, it was her. Because well, she not only was a woman, she was a brilliant woman. I mean, she knew how to get what she wanted out of me. I don't think nobody else could have done that. All of those things that you see in the movie were nothing but games. And I knew they were games. You understand that? I mean, that was to get control of the population. I mean, I never would have gone to Ole Miss if I hadn't known that the Kennedys was going to send the 101st and the 82nd and all them other crack troops. You understand? Without that commitment, which they didn't want to make because it was then hoping to be a second-term president. So, I mean, but you understand, I mean, without my personal knowledge that the military was not only on alert but was coming, I would have never went. You see, my belief always is a good soldier ain't never a dead soldier. A good soldier is one that's always around to fight.
Did they let you know that they were ready to use the troops?
You better believe it or I wouldn't have went.
Did you fear for yourself?
Well, you know, I don't know really how to answer that. I mean, because fear got to, you see, philosophy is really important. Now, I had fear, but my only fear was not being successful in accomplishing my mission. And my mission was to live. As far as I was concerned, I'd been dead all my life. If I hadn't been dead, I wouldn't have got behind the black curtain on the Greyhound bus. You understand? I was a dead man. I was fighting to live. So most people talk about fear, they talking about dying, living. That didn't mean much to me. I mean that because, you know, I have believed, you see, before I went into the Air Force, as a senior in high school, the American Legion had a contest, why I'm proud to be an American. And I entered that contest and won. Now, because I really believe that America, and my theory was, I'm not proud to be an American for what it is, but for what it can become. And I really believe that. And I still believe that, and it ain't there yet. I don't want nobody to get that idea. But I genuinely believe that.
1962, and you actually go and meet Registrar Ellis. What were you thinking? If all of a sudden they handed you a pen and said, you've done it.
I was thinking that the Registrar Ellis was the only man on the campus with spirit. I mean, in spite of him saying register.
Did your paths cross with Ross Barnett's afterwards?
Oh, many, many times. I mean, as a matter of fact, I like to think it was the best restaurant in Mississippi, the LaFleur's restaurant. And I never seen him when he didn't shake my hand, not once. My goal was to make every black boy feel like that he was superior to me, and if old James Meredith can make it, I can make it. And it literally turned out that way. Everybody felt sorry and pity for James Meredith. For one time, they was talking about how I was going to fail, and I encouraged it to the hilt. You understand? Because, first of all, I think I made one B. But it was very important for the mass of the people to think that there's this struggle and scuffle in James Meredith. And then when I make it, oh boy. And it has, I'm pretty sure it turned out that way. I don't want to take credit, but I know that was my goal. But the single most significant thing that I think has happened in my life was October last year at the University of Mississippi when they put up a statue of James Meredith between the Lyceum building, which is not only well known but going to be known for a long time, and the library. Because I don't know exactly what it means. I don't have no good reason to believe that the university even know what they intended to try to do. But I consider it the most significant thing, not really for me, but for the black-white race issue in America.
Your sharing these stories with us has been extra special. Ladies and gentlemen, James Meredith.
James Meredith tried again to register at the University of Mississippi, this time at its Jackson office, and this time accompanied by John Doerr of the Justice Department and U.S. Marshal James McShane.
funny thing happened there when we came down that hall that you saw the police coming down this narrow hallway, and I thought that we were going to go through a door at the end of the hall, but as we got, I was first, and then Meredith followed me, and then McShane, and when we got to the end of the hall, the door to which I thought we were going to enter was closed, and we were kind of moved sideways, and a door on the side of the hall opened, and there stood the Honorable Ross Barnett, and the television cameras came down over my shoulder, as I remember it, and before Barnett spoke, at length he looked at me, and then he looked at Meredith, and then he looked at McShane, and he said, "Which one of you is James Meredith?"
Thousands of black people felt the victory and saw James Meredith as an example to follow, a symbol, like the Little Rock Nine, of their own power to move the nation.
Well, obviously he was a courageous man. He had lots of nerve, and he was stubborn, persistent. He knew his own mind, and nobody was going to tell him what he should do or what he should not do. This segregation of blacks throughout the South and many places in the country would not have been solved with military. The strategy was focused on voting, and if ever we've seen a situation where the strategy is judged by the results, just look at what happened last week or on Tuesday. I mean, this is... Nobody in the world can believe that we did it. There hasn't been a country in the history of the world that has ever been able to as effectively solve a race or religious problem like this country has solved the race problem.
Referred to as the Gary Cooper of the Kennedy civil rights team. I know you're humble about all this stuff, but
you know, newspaper people, when they get stuck, they make it up.
Well, here's one of those articles. As bottles, bricks, and stones began to crash around him, he urged the crowd to disperse, reminding them that Medgar Evers wouldn't want them to resort to violence. He asked for help in moving people along, and surprisingly, many listened and complied. I believe that had John Doerr not done what he did, many people would have been killed, said Mr. Henderson. There would have been a riot of epic proportions. Goes on. It is impossible to imagine what direction the civil rights movement would have turned that day without Doerr. A man trained for a courtroom, not to calm an angry crowd. That wasn't his job. He was only there because he was a friend of Evers and wanted to pay his respect. Doerr told Charles Portis of the Los Angeles Times that he took his life in his own hands because, quote, it seemed the only thing to do. Portis went on in his article, said, quote, the Justice Department's John Doerr, a 6'2", 41-year-old unflappable Irishman from Wisconsin, is becoming the Marshall Dillon of the troubled South.
And all I can say is, what are you going to do when what am I going to do when I hear this? It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Tell you about the students really were heroes. That Bob Moses, Diane Nash, Chuck McDew, John Lewis, they were really put themselves in really danger. And what Bob always says is that the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice gave them crawling space in Mississippi in 1961 through 1964. Just gave them crawling space. They had just a little room to move around. And they kept at it, and they kept at this voting, and urging people to go down to register. By 63, conducting mock elections because for governor and for the various federal officials that were up for office.
Monday, June 22nd, 1964, you get a call at your home in Chevy Chase, Maryland. On the line was Mary King, a staff worker in the Atlanta office of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. King told Dorr alarming news. On the first day of the Freedom Summer, 3 civil rights workers were missing in East Central Mississippi. King explained that Mickey Schwermer, Andrew Goodman, and James Cheney had set out from Meridian on Sunday morning in a blue station wagon to investigate a church bombing in rural Neshoba County, a known high-risk area. When the 3 failed to return in the afternoon as scheduled, movement workers called local hospitals, jails, and law enforcement offices. The calls yield no word on the whereabouts of the civil rights worker. Could Dorr help? King asked. What was your response when you got that call?
Well, we called the Bureau right away and asked them to conduct an investigation. There was no hesitancy about initiating an investigation, and it was that investigation that really changed the attitude and the effectiveness of the FBI. Before that, the FBI was not a very effective law enforcement agency in the South on civil rights matters. But after that tragedy occurred, President Johnson sent Allen Dulles down to Mississippi to make an investigation, and he came back, and among the things he recommended was that Mr. Hoover beef up the FBI capability in Mississippi, and Mr. Hoover did that.
Portions of your closing statement. I wonder if you would read those last 2 paragraphs, because at least for those who have been Jackson fans, you'll see the connection.
This is an important case. It's important to the government. It's important to the defendants, but most important, it's important to the state of Mississippi. What I say here, what the other lawyers say here today, what the court says about the law will be soon forgotten. But what you 12 people do here today will long be remembered. Then I went on to say the defendants will stand before you on this record in the case, and they will beg of you of indulgence. In effect, they will say, as Gloucester said as he stood over the body of his slain king, say I slew him not. The king replied, then say they were not slain, but they are dead. If you find that these men are not guilty of this conspiracy, it would be as true to say that there was no nighttime release from jail by Cecil Price. There were no white nights. There were no young men dead. There was no murder. If you find that these men are not guilty, you will declare the law of Neshoba County to be the law of the state of Mississippi.
The proudest part of my career would be, how would you fill in that blank?
Proudest part was working in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, enforcing federal law with respect to free opportunity for all citizens to vote, free of discrimination.
Conclusion that Professor Neeson used when they honored you. And he concludes, I just think that you deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, John Dorr. John Dorr, a true American hero. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
One Sunday morning I was in there, and Bobby, first thing Bobby said to me is, I meant to be on Meet the Press this morning, and I'm just tied up with this Mississippi thing. Will you go on and do it for me? I'll tell them. So I did. And I came back, and I had some work to do, and about 1 o'clock, 1:30, I went into his office and said, I'm going home now. Anything you want me to do? And he said, you got anything important on this afternoon? I said, no. He said, would you mind going down to Mississippi and taking charge of the thing down there? He said, we don't have any senior official down there. And he said, I think if things go wrong, we'll be heavily criticized if we don't have somebody down there who's senior. And I can't go. He couldn't go. I mean, he would have started a riot just by being there. So I said, no, it's okay. I'll go. He said, I'll get a plane, take you. About then, my assistant, Harold Reese, stuck his head in the door. Bobby said, oh, Harold, he said, you got anything important on this afternoon? And Harold said, no. And Bobby said, well, how about you going with Nick down to Mississippi? So we did. We got a plane and went down there. And I don't know. I don't really know what we could have done. I've always thought it was a failure. But it was mostly, at least I like to blame it on the university more than I do on anything else. I mean, we were down there. It became obvious as the kids were coming back. We had Colonel Birdsong and the Highway Patrol was there. And it was obvious we had all these marshals with their helmets on and tear gas and so forth, and big armbands. And it was obvious that they were very annoying to the kids. And even early on, I asked the university, can we use the gymnasium so I can put away these 300 marshals or 400 marshals, whatever I had? The university said no. I had no place to put them. We were in the Athenaeum building, which was a sacred building to them and the Ole Miss, and by the Grove there. And it probably was the most irritating place we could have picked, but I didn't know any better. I didn't know anything about Ole Miss. I don't think anybody did. And then we had the developments, and Colonel Birdsong decided to pull out, and kids were throwing rocks and taunts and so forth and so on, and they got built up, and then they let the marshals use tear gas. It was getting pretty bad.
The situation in Oxford was becoming very tense as hundreds of people streamed into the area to defend Ole Miss and the Southern way of life.
We have had reports throughout, not merely the students, but of all kinds of people pouring in cars in order to prevent Meredith from being admitted to Ole Miss. One has to remember also that that was the squirrel hunting season in Mississippi, so there were literally hundreds, thousands of guns. Every pickup truck had a couple of guns in it, and so that the situation was really very dangerous.
The next day, Sunday, September 30th. Finally, President Kennedy decided the time had come to enroll James Meredith at Ole Miss.
And all the world are upon you and upon all of us.
The marshals were ordered not to use guns against the rioters, who were shooting and throwing Molotov cocktails. And the rioters were targeting the media, smashing cameras and attacking reporters.
So then we had the military come in. They had enough troops come in down there to Oxford, Mississippi, they could have kept right on going, taking Cuba.
Was there any moment of physical danger for yourself?
I suppose there must have been. I don't know. I wasn't particularly conscious of it. It was all kind of funny. I mean, we had a radio communication set up, which we had planned on in case there was problems to control the marshals. And the radio, the big radio, was set up in the basement of the courthouse. And then we had another set, which was set up in the Athenaeum building, smaller, and then we had walkie-talkies. So we had communication throughout the area. We used that to know what was going on, to get permission to use tear gas and so forth, I put a dime in a payphone, it was only a dime then, and called the White House collect, and got the president and Bobby on the phone, and maintained that throughout the whole time. It was quite funny, really.
As an open line?
Open line the whole time,
Payphone collect?
from payphone
White House
collect
charges
to the White House, yep. And so we knew what,
Story, chairman of MCI talking about this.
we knew what was going on, they didn't.
Right.
And the Army didn't. And of course, this made a lot of problems. And the Army, President Kennedy would say to the Army, "Where are the troops?" And the Army would say, "They're just now landing at Oxford, the airport there." And he would call me and say, "Are the troops there?" And I'd call the guy at the airport on the walkie-talkie. He said, "No troops around here." So we go back. The president was just furious at the Army, and it really wasn't their fault. They had no communications at all. And they had misunderstood some of the instructions badly. I don't know how, I don't know, but we had told them we didn't want loaded guns, because if they had to be used, we wanted to come in without loaded guns because of fear that we thought we could control the marshals, but we didn't know about the Army. But they had interpreted that as having no guns at all. So they were all standing around ready to go, but they had no guns, so they had to find guns for all the Army and so forth.
Deployment of federal troops was exactly what Kennedy had wanted to avoid. The next day, Governor Barnett called the White House with an alternate plan.
I'll tell you what I'll do, Mr. President.
Yeah.
I'll go up there myself.
Well, now, how long will it take you to get
And
there?
I'll get a microphone and tell them that you have agreed to be removed.
Now, wait a minute. Wait a minute, Governor. Now, how long is it going to take you to get up there?
About an hour.
Now, I tell you what, if you want to go up there, then you call me from up there, and then we'll decide what we're going to do before you make any speeches about it.
This man has just died.
Did he die?
Yes.
Which one? State police?
That's state police.
Yeah. Well, you see, we got to get order up there, and that's what we thought we were going to have.
President, please, why don't you, can't you give an order up there to remove Meredith?
How can I remove him, Governor, when there's a riot in the street, and he may step out of that building and something happened to him? I can't remove him under those conditions. Well, we've got to get somebody up there now to get order and stop the firing and the shooting. And then you and I'll talk about what's the best thing to do with Meredith.
While the president and the governor argued, the riot worsened. Finally, Katzenbach asked the White House for troops. It took hours for them to arrive, and during the night, 35 marshals were shot, and 2 people, a French journalist and an Oxford worker, were killed. But by dawn, the Army had restored order.
Of course the president's going to win in the end. He's got the whole armed forces of the United States. He can call in the Air Force. He can bring Navy ships up the Mississippi River. He can call out the Army as he did. He can drop parachuters in. I suppose he could shoot missiles at Oxford, Mississippi. So he's going to win at the end.
And later, James Meredith came to my private office, and I accommodated the registration there.
It wasn't a cause for laughter and champagne, but it was a cause for some relief, and it was the fact that was over with. I mean, in a way, Oxford had become the symbol of massive resistance and the final gasp of the Civil War, if you want to look at it that way. And it was over. It had ended.
It was a lonely victory for James Meredith, but it was a victory for him and the country. The Constitution had held and been reaffirmed in a major crisis. Thousands of black people felt the victory and saw James Meredith as an example to follow, a symbol, like the Little Rock Nine, of their own power.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce one of the courageous, one of the beautiful sisters of the movement. I met Dorothy Carden many, many years ago when we both were much younger. She was working with SCLC, working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., teaching people how to pass the so-called literacy test. Dorothy Carden.
And I know I told you much more than you asked me, but...
Any other questions?
But I can come right from Goldsboro to Raleigh, then still in North Carolina, to Petersburg, Virginia, and then to moving to Atlanta, and then and moving up to Ithaca. I don't know which place is home. There. Anywhere I hang my hat is home. Anybody like the blues? But,
okay. I just gotta, that was great.
I'm such a ham.
Well, it's great. I watched the actor's student, yeah, and he was doing an interview with Robin Williams.
Yeah.
And he never got a question in. I'm sensing this is where this is going, baby.
Yeah, you have to watch me.
So, yeah. So if in fact that's okay.
You can put your hand up and I'll get the message.
No. We're here to learn about you.
I'm the education director, but guess what? When they needed a coffee, Dorothy, could you? Well, we need somebody to take minutes, like women, like they can't write. And now, see, but the women's movement hadn't happened then. I'm talking about before the 70s when the women's movement happened. So when they, now I would say, Martin, let me show you. Now here's the way you make coffee. You put some coffee in and then you push this button or plug it in or whatever you think that I would say that. But actually, it was a man, I'll never forget, Jack Odell on our staff, who said, Dr. King, Dorothy needs to stay in here, be a part of this discussion, because we're talking about, well, let's say we're talking about how we're going to go into Birmingham and respond to Reverend Shuttlesworth's invitation to come over to Birmingham. But the beginning of the citizenship education program, which is a program I really want people to know about, and this is why I emphasize we didn't just march. Nobody, and I don't care if the governor did stand there saying, you segregation now, segregation forever. But nobody can take away your privileges, and here the Supreme Law says that. A little bit here, but yeah, you have a right peaceably to assemble. Translated, that meant, we jolly well can march from Selma to Montgomery. Now, see, I already have a master's degree from Boston University, but I learned more about civics, as we used to call it, helping these people understand and put your flesh and blood, as they say, on meat on the bones of these documents on which the country was founded. You have a right peaceably to assemble. The violence was real, but so was the joy in realizing that we were at last doing something to change a really sorry state of affairs in the country. A sentence that I like to repeat a lot is that if things are going to change, we have to change it. You know, it was, you read the letter from a Birmingham jail, and the ministers who wrote a letter complaining about our being in Birmingham. You know, they talked about, as many people did, you know, wait, cool off. And, you know, somebody said, this wasn't Dr. King, said, if we wait any longer, we'll be in a deep freeze. And how much longer do we have to wait for very, very basic rights?
How much did the songs of the movement become part of your citizenship?
They were incredibly important because, I don't know, do black folks, do we just sing all the time, y'all? We pretty much, in the churches, anybody who's, in some of the churches in the South, I don't know if y'all sing in your church, but people, I used to go to church, people just could strike up a song, or if somebody started a song, somebody else would jump in and help them out. What the Spirit says to everybody, what the Spirit says do, I'm going to do, oh Lord, I'm going to do what the Spirit says. Okay, let's do it. I'm going to do what the Spirit says to do. I'm going to do what the Spirit says to do. For what the Spirit says to do, I'm going to do, oh Lord, I'm going to do what the Spirit says to do. set that with the sorrow songs, the songs of hope, the songs of celebration. Out of every mood, there were songs. I don't know if we would have had a civil rights struggle movement had it not been for the singing. When we talk about organizing a nonviolent campaign, there are very specific steps that I use, and a lot of people, us who work together, use this pattern. But it's about college students say, well, what do we do about whatever? I said, well, what do you want to do? Okay, they have no answer. Okay, you want to organize a campaign? Let me tell you how you organize it. First, you get the facts. But the last step in a nonviolent campaign is always reconciliation. That is the goal. It's what Muhammad Gandhi said. It's what Martin Luther King said. It's what Jesus said. It's what Buddha said. It's what all the great spiritual teachers in the universe. The idea is to learn how to flow together. We don't even know how to have dialogue. But anyway, 6 steps on a nonviolent campaign. Maybe we can do a workshop on that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dorothy Cotton.
Come by here, my Lord.
I don't know if we would have had a movement had we not sung together.
Come by here.
We sang from the many moods and experiences that we were going through. We actually could tell the whole story of that great struggle that rearranged the social order in this country. We could tell the whole story through its music.
Bill Plante has covered much of what's gone on in the last 40 years in the United States. I'm thrilled and honored to introduce Bill Plante.
Thank you very much, Greg. I wish I could have been with you in March, but you saw me glowing in the dark after Chernobyl, right? Which was a fun trip. Another story. I'm delighted to be here. I was hoping that I could be with you in March, but that didn't work out, so I'm very glad that this did. I'm very glad because the 100th anniversary of Justice Marshall's birth provides a wonderful takeoff point for me to talk about what I first did when I came into network news. Now, I hasten to add, I was asked to be brief, and I will be. I mean, for those of us in television, brevity is the usual. We get a minute and a half. In fact, there's, of course, a story that I love, which I think I first heard from David Brinkley, which has it that if television had been invented when the Ten Commandments were handed down, the report would have gone something like this. Good evening. From CBS News, this is Newsbreak. At Mount Sinai today, God gave Moses 10 commandments. Here are the 3 most important. So in that spirit, let me tell you why I am really delighted to be here on Justice Marshall's birthday. The civil rights movement was the first thing that I covered when I went to work for CBS News. Was I prepared to do that? Not in any real sense. I'm from Chicago. I had never been further south than St. Louis. I was sent to Philadelphia, Mississippi in summer of 1964, where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered. I might as well have gone to the dark side of the moon for all I understood about what I was about to see and experience. So I have I think, an appreciation for the work that Justice Marshall did in preparing the way for the civil rights movement that I then reported on for the next several years. My wife and I had the opportunity to see the play Thurgood, which is on Broadway, the work of George Stevens, I'm sorry. Roger was the founder of the Kennedy Center. I get them confused. George Stevens Jr. wrote Thurgood, and it's a wonderful picture, a wonderful portrait of Justice Marshall and his devotion to the rule of law.
illustrates how Marshall's work with the NAACP in the 30s, 40s, and 50s built the foundation for the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and 70s. In the play, there is a line very well delivered by Lawrence Fishburne, who's wonderful in the part, which has Justice Marshall laughing over the idea that after Brown, well, in 5 years, most of the schools would be desegregated. Laughable indeed. I was in high school when Brown was announced. I remember thinking with all the satisfied certainty of a 16-year-old, well, that's the end of segregation. Good. But of course, no such thing. But as Thurgood Marshall moved onto the bench in 1961, the careful and thorough legal approach which he constructed and charted continued. By the time I began working for CBS News in 1964, the civil rights movement had begun in earnest the push for voting rights. The headlines were in the clashes, the arrests, the murderous outrages. But the foundation was the foundation that Thurgood Marshall had put in place, anchored firmly to the rule of law. There was tension between the civil disobedience of Dr. King and the idea of the rule of law. Roger Stevens alludes to it in, George Stevens alludes to it in the play when he has Marshall suggest that he didn't always agree with Dr. King's tactics. As Stevens put it to me in a conversation, Thurgood thought that you shouldn't break the law. But at the NAACP in the 50s, he defended the freedom riders and the civil rights demonstrators. In the play, Stevens has Marshall grumbling a little bit about the fact that they got stuck with the cost of all that. But he just grumbles a bit. The foundation that Thurgood Marshall laid down was in place when Dr. King began his voter registration drives in Alabama in 1965 in January. And that's when I began to cover him regularly. And after the violent clash at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in March, which you saw in my wife's film, the drive culminated in the march from Selma to Montgomery in late March of that year. But the legal battle continued in the courts while the demonstrations went on in the streets. And it was just as key as the demonstrations. I went back and looked at a report that I wrote in early February of 1965. It was for radio. And here's what it said. The battle going on in the courts is more important in many respects, but the demonstrations in the streets provide the drama lacking in the courtroom. So, though a federal injunction last week ordered a speed up in registration, the marching on the Dallas County Courthouse will continue because Negro leaders hope to force the registrar's office to take applicants more often than the 2 days a month provided for by state law. The tension continued as well. Another report from around the same time. There are voices of moderation counseling the Negro leadership to stop demonstrating. The Justice Department reportedly has made a request for an end to the demonstrations. We who covered the movement watched as it provided the impetus that led up to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was signed in August. As with Brown, the hopeful assumption that the Voting Rights Act would quickly remedy the inequalities in registration was way too optimistic. The law had to continue to work. The strategy of law underpinned by the strategy of nonviolence underpinned by the rule of law came under a great deal of pressure after the emotional high point of the voting rights signing, because just 5 days later, the riots broke out in Watts. Watts was the first violent uprising of the 60s, a time when the rule of law seemed to be disconnected from the social fabric. Militants applauded the upsetting of order. Conservatives saw it as the consequences of civil rights legislation gone way too far. So I guess in retrospect, it seems to me that the creative tension which existed between the law as Marshall championed it and the push for urgent change is what delivered the most lasting results. And in the end, it is the appeal that people like Justice Marshall made through the law and Dr. King made through his personal witness to what Lincoln so famously called the better angels of our nature, that is what distinguishes us as a people. Thank you very much.